Hello, today is Wednesday, February 7th, and this is the SIG testing subproject focusing on the testing commons. I'll start off the agenda today. If you could fill in details on who's attending, helpful, because people do read the notes. I'm getting feedback or echo from somebody. All right. First, question is kind of the first couple questions are about like reviews and policy for how we want to deal with this repository. I don't have strong feelings. I don't think we need to label anything because everything in this repository already is directly applicable to this smaller group of people or SIG testing itself. So I know I have this comment up here, but I'm happy to remove it. Does anyone have any comments about labeling PRs? Nope. All right, good. I love stuff like this. Deleted, happy. All right, so the next one I will move up the list is what list or what at should we be poking when we want to get reviews on PRs that come in?
Maybe it's not that relevant anymore because I saw that this kind of got some traction and people are commenting and reviewing and so on. So for now, I'm happy, but still the more reviewers or people who are interested in, the better.
Yeah, it's usually the way the upstream works. This is kind of like a downstream sub-project, if you want to call it that, is that the upstream will always add a list to poke the right people. I think it makes sense to do SIG testing PR reviews because I'm on that. Maru, are you on that list?
Which list?
So let me open up a thing here and go to Kubernetes, number one link in the backlog. All right, go to teams. There's only 296 teams. We need more teams. That's sarcasm. SIG testing PR reviews. There are 8 members here. Maru, it doesn't look like you're on that list.
There's probably a good reason for that because today SIG testing PR reviews means
general catch-all.
Well, but it's like test infra. Like I don't really care about what you're doing with kubetest or what you're doing with it's CI stuff is what I'm saying, and that's just like not my domain.
Sure, I agree to that. So this conversation is fruitful. Let's look at.
So we need SIG testing.
Let's go to orgs. Go to, what is it? SIG testing?
Kubernetes SIG testing, I think. Yeah, I would say, yeah, people who want to participate should be on this team. I should, just as a, so we have another interested party from Red Hat. Robert, if you want to introduce yourself, if you can. Okay.
You have to unmute, Robert.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, sorry about that. Hi, I'm Robert Krowitz from Red Hat. Sorry about the background noise there. I recently joined Red Hat, I guess about 2 months ago. I've been in the industry for about 30 years now. A lot of my roles have been integration leads and similar, and as such, I have considerable interest in seeing merges tested effectively, but also without these so-called test flakes. So I've had my share of experience coming up with testing, and this is something that's of interest to me here.
I'm excited to have more people for testing. So I just wanted to introduce Robert so that he could be. I'm assuming that he would like to be joining this team that you're creating.
Correct. Yeah. By the way, apologies for no video. At least for the time being, I don't have enough bandwidth while I'm at home to share video. I won't go into the story, but just suffice it to say that right now I can't share video.
Okay. Since we're kind of doing introductions, you might want to mute Robert because you got an echo going on. I highly recommend, as a former Red Hatter and person who's worked in open source for a long time, microphone headphones are super helpful for this type of gig. Seeing how we're doing that, Liz, do you want to chime in here real quick? I know I've kind of given you broad hand waving motions with regards to integration test framework, but just introduce yourself, it might be helpful. I know you're sick too.
Unmute.
It's possible that Liz might be sick.
Oh, sorry. Did you mention me?
Yeah, we were just doing slight introductions for folks who are working together on this stuff.
Oh,
Yeah.
gotcha. Sorry, I am. Yeah, like you said, I am not quite at 100%. Which is why there's no video, because I look a little out of sorts. I'm a Heptio engineer as of last October. I work a lot on Sonobuoy. I am relatively new to the Kubernetes space. I don't know. Did I miss anything important?
No. So I think to answer some of the previous questions about like team organizational structure, I think just having a separate reviewers sub-team makes a lot of sense, so you don't have to view in the world. So I'll create a visible team. Confirm.
Cool, thanks.
Okay. If folks want to add themselves to that list, that's easy enough to do. You can just request to join, I believe, and you should be good.
Although, to be honest, I'm for the repo that's focused like this one is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, can't you just subscribe?
You can, but it's all a matter of how you do your massive GitHub filter apparatus, whatever that may be. I have filters for filters that further filter things. So I've been on this project for too long. But yeah, it's completely up to you if you want to subscribe or add the members. But the members, the useful thing there is it just calls out people to help do reviews, and you should be able to join. So I'll take a look at that later. So that kind of takes care of two bits here. All right, follow up from last time. Haynes and Gareth look at test utils and test integrations to see what they can steal. How is the progress there?
There was not much progress in the last week because we had to deal with other stuff, but that's definitely on our list. And if we like progress with our framework, with the functionality of the framework, we will definitely have a look on what we can steal. And I think also Maroon already gave us some pointers to other stuff, which we could potentially steal or have a look at. So yeah, not much progress right now, but it's in the back of our heads.
As part of that bit, Maru and I were talking, and I was also talking with Liz about this. It would be ideal if we had a very simple abstraction layer that for integration tests that basically said, give me a cluster of this shape. And on the back end, it could be whatever, right? We don't really care. We don't want to be prescriptive. But then you get back a client-side handle that your tests can actually run against then. Ideally, one of the implementations for that back end would potentially be a distillation of one of the many DIND setups or Docker and Docker configurations.
Well, I mean, to me, there's kind of like the simplest thing is have an API server. And then if you want to get more complicated, you could have an API server and some controllers. And you want to get more complicated, you could add some hollow nodes. You want to get more complicated, could you add Docker and Docker nodes? So it's like, to me, it's like there's these layers of complexity that I think you could be able to do just something simple, because then the execution and the failure domain is really tiny. You need to, but I guess I do think that Tim's point about whatever setup you call, passing whatever configuration, and then you get back, not a client, I realize, but a configuration. I've been kind of working on some integration testing around aggregation, and it's like, you just want the configuration. A client is very specific because it's like, oh, I'm pointing to the Cube API, but you could be pointing to an aggregated API as well. There could be other things in there. You don't know what client you need. But if it's the config, then whoever is consuming this can decide what client they want to target it at the given point.
Yeah, the problem is the config is so, it's, how do I use code? The config is very, I don't think anyone likes it, right? It's not as clean but it's what everyone uses.
I totally agree, but the problem is that the clients are configured anyway, so whether we hide that detail or not. I mean, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have something where it's like get cube client, but I'm saying you need the option of getting cube config so you can configure other APIs to the cluster. That's all.
Just to understand the thing you're talking about, when you say a config, you actually mean the kube config YAML thingy? Or are you talking about, for example, the rest.config thing, that Go structure, or are you actually talking about a file or the contents of a file which can be used as a kube config?
I am probably talking about an in-memory config, but it could be, I mean, they're translatable, so it's like whether I have an in-memory config or something that would be serialized to a file. The point is that I need something to be able to configure an in-memory client. Like maybe in the case of testing kubectl, that's not the case, but for testing any third-party API server, you just need a kube config object. So.
I think what I'd like to do here is to rally on kind of a design spec, or I would like to make it formalized and be a KEP, right? Which would basically be like almost like I call them design sketches, because I think design specs are filthy lies. So we would basically have a listing of requirements of what we want and a timeline with what we would propose, as well as an overall sketch of how we kind of envision it working, and then start to kind of trek against that, because I think there are pieces of this that are broadly applicable outside of the scope of straight up Kubernetes repositories. And I think there are a ton of folks in the ecosystem who would love this tooling. I would love this tooling for Sonobuoy. I would love to be able to point it at a well-defined library and get back a structured setup that I specify, and I can build this as part of my integration testing without me having to, build up an entire apparatus that blasts out to cloud providers or whatnot. But it actually tests real binary bits versus like the weird in-memory cribbed setup that exists for the current integration tests.
You kind of want both, but I agree that, I don't know.
Well, I as a consumer, an external consumer, I don't care about the internal in ones. I do think that the KK repo will definitely care about the internal component configurations. But as a consumer, I really don't care. I really just want some predefined prescriptive way for me to stand up an environment that gives me back a config or a client that I can then run and exercise my tests against, that is as close to reality without me having to blast out a full cluster.
So I'm struggling a little bit to understand how we're going to be able to, like, fine, we're targeting binaries. But if I want to configure a given binary, like, there's a lot of configuration possible just on API server, let alone controllers.
So that we're working on. So the component configuration in memory or on cluster config is a work in progress, right? And people are working on it. So like the long-term goal of a lot of the kubeADM and SIG cluster lifecycle work is to have component configuration for each of the individual elements live as an in-memory on-cluster configuration that can be dynamically changed on the fly. So,
okay.
so long as you have the API for that component, you should be able to change and modify it and restart it and do everything else you need to do. And that's kind of the way, as a requirement for kubeADM to go to GA, we absolutely require that the kubelet have the dynamic kubelet configuration be GA'd. Because what happens with the kubelet is you bootstrap it and it could change over time, and you don't want to deal with that. You want to have a versioned configuration that lives in the cluster that as you update can be updated as well.
I guess I'm not entirely clear on how an integration test would source this, because maybe I don't want to run a cluster. I mean, I guess if it's just a matter of having an API server, it's accessible to a given component, and there's a config map there, I guess that's okay. But I think the implication of in-cluster config right now for me is expecting to have, like, via the downward API, like, access to the API. Like I automatically acquire credentials to get to the API server, and I want to make sure that it's possible to run things standalone.
Yes, absolutely.
And I should say, I've heard that some people don't even want to enable that because they want to discourage people running that in production, but I absolutely think we need it for testing.
Well, can you be more specific there? I'm a little fuzzy by what you mean by standalone, because the minimum bar for almost everything in kubeADM is the kubelet is the kicker for the components, right? And that's like the minimum bar is the kubelet controls the processes. From there, it can control 1 to n processes.
That's useful for some types of testing, but requiring that I am running, say, a controller that I'm trying to test in a container, I don't think that's always a good idea. Like, sometimes I want to be able to say run a debug version. I don't want to have to be in a container space to be doing it, right? To me, it's like that. I think there's a split between, like, I want to run this in production, I want to manage by the kubelet, and I want to be able to validate that in some kinds of testing, but I also want to just run this controller, you know, targeting an API server that I'm composing in an integration test. And so I want that component, whether it be a controller or something else, to be able to source its configuration from somewhere that doesn't require it to, like, use the download API, I guess is what I'm saying.
Doesn't require to use the downward API. Why is I don't see that this is a barrier to, like, the interface layer, and there can be multiple implementations, right? Like, and we could have layers for the implementations over time. I just don't want it to get too Cambrian, but it'd be nice to know the requirements for that restriction and why. I would like to hermetically seal as much as possible because it just makes things more convenient, but I understand the desire to want to. Sometimes you just need to do what you need to do, right? And it's not always clear or as easy to describe all the details because some of them are just weirdly ingrained with the state of where the system is at.
I'm entirely convinced that it's possible to do standalone and still have in-cluster configuration. I think that's useful. I'm like right now I'm seeing that's useful. Like if I'm trying to run an aggregated API server, and currently the code is kind of tricky for figuring out how you actually get to avoid in-cluster configuration and just provide it on a command line. Anyway, sorry, I'm kind of tangenting. I'll stop.
Yeah, what we can do here is we can, I think, start rallying on the spec.
But I guess my point is, though, that today, like, yes, component config is an end goal. But for things that don't have that yet, I guess if we're expecting component config to be available, within a reasonable, time frame, that means that we're just going to duplicate configuration details in this repo.
Well,
in order to be able to configure the binaries in a reasonable way.
The way it's done in kubeadm today, and I think it's actually the best of worst solutions, right? Like there's no, it's a Kobayashi Maru, right? There's no good answer to this. So it's the best solution to a bad problem, is that it composes the YAML for a pod and the args that are specified there. And then it submits the component, whether it be the controller manager or the scheduler, based upon the input arguments that allow you to override the default configuration. So you basically have like, I have these knobs, which are meta knobs, that then create and construct the pod manifest file with all of these other args that are filled in appropriately to spin that component as a pod, right? And that's not terrible. It's not.
The reason component config is a desirable thing is because flags aren't versioned.
Yes.
So flags can change, can go away, it can break.
And they're not hierarchical, which you'd like,
right.
Ideally you'd want to have like hierarchical configuration parameters.
So if I'm saying like if the end goal is like I want to have a component config that's versioned, that if I'm writing a test against and I'm vendoring the frameworks repo, my tests aren't going to break because some binary decided to change its arguments. And I have to go figure out, what happened? Oh, this version, I have to use this version of the binary, otherwise these flags aren't going to be there. Like, I don't know. I know this is a little bit hypothetical, but I'm like,
that's kind of specific. That's specific to the test, though, I think, at this point in time. Like, we can abstract a framework that totally doesn't even care and then does call-outs. I think we're kind of in the weeds. There's a lot of thorns on how you can deal with configuration of the components. Like right now, I don't even know how many parameters the API server has anymore. Is it like 60?
But I guess when I'm thinking about, I want to run a cluster.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of configuration you can set. And are we going to we're not going to take any responsibility for providing sane ways to manage that configuration? Like if I want to do like an SSL server, or like secured transport, then I have to like generate certs and do all this sort of stuff. But what if they want to override any of the parameters that I'm setting? How do they do that?
That's kind of what kubeadm does today. That's the whole purpose and design of kubeadm, is to like have this prescriptive way of at least giving you an exit strategy for well-defined configurations and standing up in an easy way.
Okay, but I'm not clear how kubeadm relates to the frameworks. Like, are you expecting we're going to try to reuse kubeadm as a way of managing integration fixture?
I envision kubeadm as the stand-up piece for the integration fixture.
What?
Like the Docker and Docker solution by Mirantis basically uses kubeadm internally, and so does the work that
That's
Quinton.
not what I'm talking about.
What are you talking about?
Like I said, there's these different layers, and fine, I want to stand up a real cluster. But if I want to stand up an API server that's configured in a certain way, and I don't care about running it in containers or running a cluster the way kubeadm does it, then I need to be able to configure those components.
Yeah, that's where I'm saying like the abstraction layer stops here, right? And the implementation of A versus B is completely up to us, right? I think over time, I have no way of saying, I have no way of saying all the different ways people are going to stand stuff up. It's too many, right? But I think if we can agree upon an interface layer and what arguments we get back, and then agree upon this is one method A and here's another method B, then that gives everybody what they want. It gives them enough of a layer of indirection as well as the ability to do their things. And I think that should be sufficient, right?
I think maybe it doesn't seem like we're on the same page, like we're talking about the same thing. Like, even if I was to back up and say I have some sort of abstraction layer that lets me provision a type of cluster, and I'm not specifying which, if I was to, how would I specify how I want that cluster configured? Irregardless of what's actually implementing the cluster deployment.
There's no unified configuration file that exists today. The closest thing is like the cluster API, which gives you I can specify a set of configs that gives me the shape and the idea of what it would look like. Right? If you're looking for a declarative model for how you're going to state what the cluster will be, is that what you're looking for?
I guess I'm questioning the value of having some sort of implementation agnostic integration cluster provisioning mechanism if there isn't one way to configure it as well. Does that make sense?
I'm a little confused by your statement.
We've talked about having I want a cluster and it will, I want it to have X nodes. Okay, that's pretty simple, and we'll fire it down to, say, Kubernetes Dyn cluster, and it'll provision something. If I wanted to actually configure, I wanted to have certain configuration values set for that cluster, how do I provide that? And that's only just for one implementation. What if I have something that uses hollow nodes and doesn't use kubeadm to deploy? How do I push down the same configuration values? Say I want to have, this API enabled, for lack of a better example.
That's going to be a matter of how we define the API for provisioning and setting up the cluster. I think we're getting way into the weeds of implementation. I think right now we got to start simple, right? And then
I just, like I said, I just don't see there's value, and I can have an API to do something unless I can configure what it's going to do. And so to me, it's I don't care how it's implemented. I'm just pointing out that this is a pretty big blocker to it being useful. Getting a cluster up is one thing. Getting up a cluster configured in a way that is valid for the type of testing that I want to do is completely another. And I think that's maybe more important.
No, I don't disagree with you. I think the problem of configuration is weird today, right? Because it's a mashing of component config as well as command line arguments to get it configured the way you want it to be. And it's not, ideally we would have a set of well-defined component configs with a well-defined set of APIs that would allow you to say it's going to look like this, right? And these are going to be the args. Right? That is the world we want to get to.
I guess my suggestion would be how much effort do we want to put into providing some sort of mechanism for configuration that sort of papers over these differences versus putting some feet on the ground towards moving everything to something that we could use. Right?
Well, if people want to, the scheduler and controller manager and kubelet all have these pieces of the puzzle done. They're in different grades of alpha, beta quality, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm not concerned about those. The API server is the thorny one that everyone kind of backs away slowly because it's got so many parameters and so many arguments that it's very difficult for people to want to commit to that work. It is a non-trivial large block of work that will require a sustained effort across multiple release cycles.
I get that. I'm just, to me, the effort that we're going to have to put into enabling configuration in a nice way for that is probably not dissimilar. I think at least there's some overlap between those. And it's kind of well, if we want to enable good testing, I mean, if someone was starting out with this, and they wanted to enable good testing at day one, they would have done this already, right? I'm just saying this to me.
There wouldn't be 10,000 args, right? Like,
Right.
if you wanted to like actually make the system wholly complete and testable, it would be hierarchical and there wouldn't be 10,000 args, because right now it's totally untested. The way it is, it's all the args are not even tested. I guarantee you that.
Right. The last thing I'll say, I promise. But I guess when I look at this problem, I see like we can paper over the problem and not take any responsibility for it. But I mean, a good integration framework is going to have some of the characteristics that we would want in the API server itself, like in terms of configurability.
I'm not going to argue with you because you're right. I'm just terrified of the amount of work that would require to make that the way people would really like to use it.
Right, but I guess the goal wouldn't be completing a solution. It would be getting it started so that as people say wanted to test a given option, they could do the work of enabling that in a generic way. Like, I want to flip this flag. Okay, go to KK and fix how that works for us. And then you can use it, as opposed to us having to do that. You know what I mean? But there just needs to be a certain amount of groundwork laid to make that possible.
I think what we can postulate and socialize, part of this is social judo, right? We need to make our idea, their idea, and their idea is brilliant across the board, right? And the social judo required here is to basically say, like, people want to have a well-defined component config for the API server. Many people want this, but it's not, no one has signed up to do this work. I think if we start to socialize the importance of it and the desire from many parties, it will start to, the whispers come from many ears, right? Not just one group, but from many groups. And that's when the single lone dissenting voice becomes a large chorus. And I think we need to play that card as well, right? Because right now, API machinery, for the most part, is myopically focused on certain sets of problems and not necessarily focused on this particular space. I think we need to maybe poke that bear to address this issue, because it is a long-standing, very large block of technical debt, and I do think that we need to solicit and rally on that bit to try and make it go. But I think what we can also do is, as we draft a proposal, is to point this out in glaring fashion, and then bring it up with other folks, right? I can bring it up in SIG architecture and basically say, like, hey guys, we really need this thing, and here's this proposal that outlines the reasons why. Does that seem like a fair attack pattern?
Yes.
So I think what we can probably do from here is craft a proposal in a Google Doc and share amongst the group to solicit requirements. And maybe for our next meeting, we can have at least a fully commented file that we can talk about more succinctly with each other to try and make progress on this. And I'm happy to get that started. And also, I'm going to talk with Liz about trying to help drive that piece of the puzzle, because there's a desire on our side to have this integration framework go. Broadly speaking, I would love to use pieces of this integration framework to destroy all of the existing development tests. That is a secret plot that I will not be so secret about.
So I guess my thinking on how to move the bar is, we need framework. That's the starting point. It makes it easier to write these tests. We need good examples of the framework's use, and then we have to go into individual SIGs that are test heavy, and we need to work with the developers as reviewers or otherwise to get them to point out, hey, you're writing something that could be done better or differently. Please do it this way. So to me, that's kind of a pattern that's worked for me in the past. I'm not sure how well it will work in Cube, but I don't think just, hey, we want to do this is sufficient.
No, I agree. There needs to be, hey, we want to do this, and hey, look at how much it makes your life better. Yeah, there's a sales pitch for sure. But we need to get the ball rolling on at least a design that we can agree on for some pieces of the puzzle that works for our use cases. Because as people want to split the repo, I don't see how they can even do that without this.
So I mean, my work is centered around enabling integration testing for cluster registry and federation, and that involves using the fixture that exists, the frameworks repo for spinning up an etcd and API server. But then I'm working on enabling like aggregation of an in-memory thing, and I'm hoping to be able to contribute that back to the framework repo. I am kind of concerned at the amount of stuff we'll have to vendor to create some of these tests. And I think, as I've said on several PRs, that we'll be forced to use release branches. Unfortunately, I don't see a way around that. But I am, at the same time, like for me, like, yes, we want framework and we want it to sort of be designed. My goal is just getting something working, and then hopefully we can reverse engineer maybe design principles out of some of that.
I think it's okay to kind of meet in the middle, like work on some implementation details and also work on the spec, and go back and forth, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big problem space. I mean, what I'm working on is fairly narrow, and I don't have any illusions that it's the entirety of what we want to focus on.
Right. Well, are there other agenda topics? Because I think we're kind of in agreement on most bits. Do you have any points you want to make, Haynes?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Is what we're saying make sense? Is it jive with what your kind of objective is?
Well, for a lot of things, I don't have enough context to understand the whole thing. But I guess I will, or at least I'll try to ramp up. So some things make sense, others don't. But
Well, feel free to ask questions too. I don't want people to be lost, or like I want the folks in this group to actively ask questions and solicit feedback and stuff too.
Yeah, sure. Just for some stuff, I don't even know the question, but yeah, as said, I will keep working on that, and if I have questions, I will just ask. Yeah.
So at some point, we'll want to be able to use this in KK, and I'm a little bit fuzzy on how, like, if we're going to be vendoring staging repos, and then those staging repos are going to be staged out of KK, there's like a circular dependency problem.
I have no idea yet how this. I have no idea how KK will have evolved by the time we get to vendor it into KK.
I guess my point would be that I'm fine with having this repo being developed in this way in the near term, but if we're actually going to use it for KK, I could honestly see us having to pivot to being a staging repo. As much as, I'm not saying it's not a good thing to be in KK. There's a lot of problems because then you're gated by a whole bunch of shit. Pardon my French. But I don't see us resolving that dependency problem without just becoming a staging repo.
Can you just quickly explain in 3 sentences what a staging repo really is? So
a staging repo, within Kubernetes, there's parts of Kubernetes that have been, or in KK, the Kubernetes repo, that have been carved off for reuse. And they are still kind of embedded in the source tree, but they are actually, if you go to the staging directory of KK, there's actually it's almost like the equivalent of like a vendor directory. There's source, kates.io, and then API, Cube Aggregator, like CodeGen. There's a whole bunch of things, and those are published periodically to those repos. So Kate's API is developed in KK and then published to this other repo. So it's a one-way. There's no bidirectionality to that. So the challenge is, I guess, is that enough? Sorry, I don't want to keep going if I'm explaining this.
Yeah, I think that explains it for me.
Okay. Anyway, I don't want to like sidetrack too much. I think that's like a danger if we're going to be attempting to integrate into KK, that we may actually have to change our approach.
Yeah, I think one of the requirements that we should probably specify in the design doc for all this stuff is that we need to have a DAG model of inclusion and vendoring, because they've spent copious amounts of time to unentangle the DAG and now have created like untangle the circle dependencies because they were in one repo, so they were able to do it before. And we should be very mindful of that, so that way as people want to take staging and actually literally split it out, which will eventually occur like with kube control, right? That they can do that in a way that, it doesn't cause import cycles, right?
I'm not too worried about us causing import cycles. Like, it's more that if we're vendoring a specific version of like a staging repo, and then we're going to be a day or two behind what's actually in Kubernetes.
Oh, I don't think we should ever vendor in staging. I think we should be very explicit to say, like, we will vendor in the separate locations that exist, right?
I'm not. When I say vendoring staging repos, I'm never talking about sourcing stuff from the Kubernetes repo.
Yeah.
Let me be clear about that. But my point is, if I was today to vendor in the frameworks repo into Kubernetes because I wanted to reuse the integration framework, that repo is depending on certain versions of, say, client Go and API machinery, which are not guaranteed to be in sync with the staging versions that are in the Kubernetes tree, right?
Yeah, that's fair. But,
So all I'm saying is, until those repos are developed entirely out of tree, because we're not depending on Kubernetes, we're just depending on the staging repos that happen to live there. Mm-hmm. So I'm saying it may be that as a short-term thing, until those repos are out of tree, we may actually have to also be in tree. Does that make sense? If we're to be reused by KK.
Yes, but I'm gonna that's a bridge that I'll cross when we get there, right? I'm totally fine with living outside the main line for a while and doing this separately and building up the corpus of information as well as the requirements, and then cross that road when we need to. But I get your point. I understand it.
I'm just concerned that the timeline to getting to like being able to revamp tests, we don't necessarily want to wait indefinitely. That's all. I
agree. And I think honestly, this will probably be more beneficial to external consumers at first. And that's kind of the main point at this point, is like, there's a bunch of people who want to test their integrations with Kubernetes, and it is a ginormous pain in the butt to do so. Like, people write their own controllers, people write their own aggregated API servers, people write their own schedulers, people write their own bits here and there, and all they want is a test jig, and they can't do that without standing stuff up.
Come on, Tim, I want to solve the world. Enable me.
Yeah. All right. So I don't think we have any. Are there any more agenda topics? I think we kind of think the horse is sufficiently beaten. Does it? How about by next week I have a document in place that we can gather on, and I'll work with Liz too as well to kind of spec out what our requirements are, because we have a concrete use case, so that helps to solicit requirements, and then we can iterate on those requirements for the broader state space of things and try to push up a KEP for broader conversation. So I think getting a document to everyone to comment on by next week, and then having a discussion for the next meeting seems like a reasonable time frame. Is that okay with other folks? He just gives me a thumbs up.
Yes, it's fine.
Okay,
I have a quick question regarding kubeadm.
sure.
How does one provide configuration to kubeadm to make
kubeadm has a
sure-
kubeadm config file. It's got its own API and a config file that you can specify to it. And that is actually defined, and there's documents for it.
And is this a superset of everything I would configure in a kube cluster?
It's very meta, yes.
So if that exists, I guess what I was just wondering is if we could just steal that.
Yep, that was kind of the plan. But you were talking in very generic things, and I wanted to entertain the idea. So in the back of my head, it was like, most of this exists. It's not as fine-grained as people would like, right? Because what happens today is I get all of the PRs I'm reviewing for kubeadm, like literally this week, are all about like, we need an extra knob for this. We need an extra knob to control that meta feature. We need an extra knob for that. So it is not complete. It is a work in progress. So until it gets to GA, it'll still be churning. But the features that exist today are not going to go away.
Okay, I guess like I'm a little bit oblivious, but I'm cluing into the fact that if somebody else is already duplicating, a meta configuration mechanism, or not duplicating, but creating that, then you could just reuse that. But is it possible to consume kubeadm without vendoring KK?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. kubeadm all the code that goes into kubeadm was designed so that it was meant to be an external thing. And currently it lives in the repo only for expediency because the facilities didn't exist. But it is wholly separable. And you can configure it without any knowledge of Kubernetes for the most part.
Okay. I guess I was kind of futzing over like how do we actually reuse code from kubeadm, but you're just suggesting we would use the configuration mechanism from outside, like from above.
And let it do its stand-up for the most part. And the one bit that's tricky with kubeadm is that you can specify optional things to disable. And if you wanted to do things like stand up hollow nodes, that would be like a separate step. That's not built into kubeadm, right? But I know that's a use case for a lot of folks.
I guess that doesn't answer my question then. Because I was thinking if there's some configuration mechanism, we could actually reuse the code. It sounds like it's like, okay, you could just use kubeadm, but
well, that's kind of the purpose of the cluster API. The cluster API is meant to be like this thing that lives above kubeadm that could blast out a cluster. But there's still, if you want to make it so it stands up components of the picture as well as the other pieces, there's some work that still needs to be done to do that. But we can do generic stand up easily with a configuration file. But that's going to stand up all the pieces, right? And there are definite use cases, as you mentioned, for standing up just two of the pieces or just one of the pieces, right? And that we can do it, but it's not all clean, right?
I guess I'm still puzzling over wanting to. I guess I just need to reconcile in my head like the difference between I'm using kubeadm to stand up a cluster versus I'm using something like kubeadm to configure like an integration cluster. And there's certain characteristics of like a more integration focused cluster that maybe I'm too fixated on.
Well, why don't we rally on the doc? Because I think the doc will help to illuminate and enumerate the different use cases that we see.
Okay.
All right. Is the horse dead now?
There's a door now.
All right. Okay. Well, I think what I'll do then is I will make an action item to follow up by next week and send out an email to this group as well as a broader group of people to try and solicit some feedback. Well, maybe I'll do that second. I'll just send it to this group to get feedback on the initial requirements and then send them a design sketch. And then Then once we've distilled it down, we can send it out to a broader group. Does that seem fair? Okay, cool. All right. So unless there's any other last minute things, I think we can adjourn. Nothing? All right. Take care, everybody.
See you.
Bye.
Ciao.